Breaking news. Please stand by for another C2C World News Now current event.
Criticisms of President Assad, but they say we elected him, we respect him, and we do not want forced regime change, because if we have that, that'll mean the country...
Secretary Boris Johnson has said the UK should consider military options in Syria now, as Laura Smith reports next from London.
He talked against this backdrop of ever-increasing violence in Syria, this toing and froing, and his comments about intervention really come at a very sensitive time for the country. He had a 2-hour grilling from MPs on Thursday morning on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and at some moments during that grilling he seemed to favour continuing negotiations with Russia, but ultimately appeared to plump for a move towards intervention, saying that the time for negotiation had run out. Here's the moment which epitomises that attitude most clearly. Let's hear it.
We should be looking again at the more kinetic options than the military options. Most people, and I think including John Kerry, feel that the process of argument, process of discussion with the Russians has basically run out of road. I think it's important not to let a general sort of blame game diffuse the central responsibility for what is taking place. This is the Assad regime. Of the 400,000 people who have died in Syria, 95% of them have been killed by the Assad regime.
So not only does Johnson say that people are changing their minds about intervention here in the UK, he actually says that he regrets the UK taking a step back from intervention when MPs voted in the House about it back at the end of 2015. And the whole of his statements about Syria were really couched in very hawkish language. He talked of forming a coalition with the United States, about taking more kinetic action. He said that we had to look at all the options. Well, we may not have to wait very long to find out what those options might be, because he's meeting on Sunday with foreign ministers. He's hosting that meeting with people who include the United States' John Kerry, to consider how to proceed in Iraq and in Syria. But again, given the escalating violence in Syria, it's pretty worrying rhetoric from Boris Johnson.
So that's the latest from London. In response, the latest from the Kremlin, and spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, the comment was this. He says that while the efforts of any state in fighting against terrorism are worthy of the highest praise, he went on to say the same cannot be said of those who fight against a country's legitimate authorities. End quote. I spoke earlier with Baroness Caroline Cox from the UK's House of Lords, who gave a report on Syria today in the British Parliament. She told me that the Western powers' plans for Syria go against the will of the people on the ground there.
Visited Aleppo, Latakia, many places. We had meetings with the Syriac Patriarch, with the Grand Mufti, with President Assad, and with local people. And so I will try to be their voice, because their voice doesn't get heard, especially on Western media. And their view is that they do not want forced regime change, thank you very much. Their view was that they elected President Assad. They have criticisms of President Assad, but they say we elected him, we respect him, and we do not want forced regime change, because if we have that, that'll mean the country will just go into the hands of the Islamist terrorists, ISIS and the other Islamist terrorist groups. There are very few moderate armed rebels left, according to them, and they're the local people they know. And they said it'll just become another Iraq, another Libya, and we want the right for the Syrian people to choose our own freedom. Thank you. So we do not want intervention.
I'm sure Boris Johnson will be fully acquainted with that as well. So with all that in mind, why is he pushing for a military intervention?
I just don't understand it. I argued against this in the House of Lords this morning. The minister was very robust on fierce criticism of President Assad, but a lot of support amongst members of the House of Lords who are very worried about two things. One is about the way the situation is represented in the media here in the West. You always hear about the attacks by the Syrian army, about their use of barrel bombs or chemical weapons. You don't hear about the use of cluster bombs and chemical weapons and attacks by the Islamic rebel groups. And I think people in Britain are beginning to wonder why. And as I say, I think there's a growing concern that an intervention which would overthrow the president and the regime would actually lead to takeover by the hardline ISIS-related groups, and it would become another Libya, and it would be a disaster.
This has been a C2C World News Now current event. Stay safe, everyone.